Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on July 12, 2014, Daniel and I spoke with Dr. Mark Thornton about the war on drugs and his 1991 book, The Economics of Prohibition. Dr. Thornton is Senior Fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and is the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He has served on the faculty at Auburn University and is the author of Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation, The Economics of the Civil War, The Quotable Mises, and the Bastiat Collection. You can follow his work on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, on the Mises Institute's Facebook page, and on the Mises Institute's website, which is mises.org. That's mises.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/economics-prohibition.
Since you just participated in this Oxford Union debate recently, what were your experience in that debate, and how were you selected to participate in that debate?
Well, that's a good question. Oxford Union can get just about anybody they want, including U.S. presidents and prime ministers. The Dalai Lama has been on that show. Mother Teresa has been at that debate. Albert Einstein. And so when I got a letter inviting me to attend, I was kind of shocked, to tell you the truth. But several people in the Oxford Union were aware of my work on the war on drugs. I also met several people after the debate at Oxford who were fans of the Mises Institute. So I guess we're making an impact. The experience was really almost surreal. Oxford and Oxford University, it's like stepping back 500 years ago in time. All the buildings, the buildings were built 1200, 1300, 1500. So except for the cars, some of the clothes, you'd think you'd jumped back into the Middle Ages, basically. And the Oxford Union debate itself, the student union is a separate institution. It's not part of the university. It's private. It's been around since 1823, and the buildings have been around at least since 1823. And the debate hall is kind of like a miniature version of the House of Commons. And there's no microphones or anything. It's set up. It's designed so where anybody can hear anybody else all around the union. And so, there's two students who get up and represent each side. They make the motion, they make the opposition, and then there's three experts on each side. And so I was teamed up with the former president of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and a member of Parliament from Cambridge. So, like the smartest guy in the House of Commons, basically. And we were up against some drug warriors, of course. And I thought we really pulled it off really well. I don't know if I made the greatest points there, but I think we based on the audience response, we certainly did win. I got the biggest laugh of the evening. So all in all, I was really pleased with how things went, and the fact that I was on time for everything and didn't get lost.
So was there some sort of process for determining a winner? Was there an audience vote or
yes,
some sort of panel vote? And how big was the audience that was watching this?
Well, that was also surreal. The bottom floor was just about packed. So it was somewhere along maybe 150 people there all total. And it was a really good turnout, they said, given that they were sort of in exam week at Oxford University. And the way they determine the vote is that you go out one of two doors. There's a nay door, which means you oppose the motion, or you go out the yay door, which is you support the motion. And the motion was this House, meaning Oxford Union, should oppose the war on drugs. So if you go out the nay door, you're supporting the war on drugs. Well, speaking, a bunch of students got up in the back and walked out the nay door. So they were supporting the war on drugs, and they were, in effect, stuffing the ballot box. And it worked out real well for them because there was a tie vote at the end, an equal number of people supporting the war on drugs and an equal number of people opposing the war on drugs. But the president of Oxford Union, his vote doesn't count. And so we ended up losing the debate by one vote on a technicality. In other words, it would have been a tie vote, which is, according to the debate coaches over there at the Oxford Union, that would be a perfect debate if you get a tie vote, because that means that the motion was properly constructed and both sides were evenly matched. So it didn't turn out like I hoped, but again, it was a big experience for me, and I think it's brings more attention to the issue. The London School of Economics had just released a large report opposing the war on drugs over there, so it was an especially big issue over in the UK right now.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, has there been a tie before in one of these debates?
That's a very good question, Adam. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to check with my contacts over there.
Okay.
Do you know, is that available online somewhere where we could see that?
Well, it's still not available online. You got to remember the Oxford Union, despite the fact that it's been around since 1823, is still a student organization. So it's organized by students who typically aren't that well organized. And so all the photographs and the audio of the debate have not been put up on their Facebook page, but they said eventually it will be up on the Oxford Union Facebook page and other sources as well. And I'll be sure to get it up on Mises.org, MISES.org, where we have the largest inventory of audio and video lectures and interviews in Austrian economics.
Okay, and once there is a link in the description of this episode as well.
Thank you, Adam.
So that people can watch that. I can't wait to see it myself.
Yeah.
So.
Like I said, it was a lot of fun, and I was very serious about this whole thing. But the night before the debate, when I was in London, and I was went to a few events, and they said, "Oh, you can't be too serious at these things. You have." You have to make fun of the other side, and you have to tell jokes. So I didn't have any in the hotel the night before. So to kick it off, because the students were very serious, I thought, very dramatic. One was a law student, the other one was a drama student, and so they were very dramatic in their opening remarks. And so I came up with something that put the American people at our expense, essentially. I opened by saying, telling the chairman of the Oxford Union, I said, I thanked him and what an honor this was, and I said that America is really responsible for the war on drugs, and I just wanted to point out, Mr. Chairman, that the war on drugs is started in America wasn't started because scientists said that it would be a good thing, or that the medical profession thought it would be a good thing. But really, in America, it was started by people who were fascist, religious zealots, people who believed in genetic engineering of people. Words, Mr. Chairman, the war on drugs is a result of the average ordinary.
Okay, let's start talking about your book, The Economics of Prohibition. So could you just explain why did you write the book and what was kind of the history leading up to writing the book?
Sure. Well, the Economics of Prohibition is probably what got me the invitation to the Oxford Union debate. In the 1980s, late 1980s, on the Economics of Prohibition, and then I turned that into a book, which was published in 1991 by not Oxford University Press, Utah University Press. And then, of course, I did a lot of other research on the war on drugs and alcohol prohibition, and have continued to write about the history of prohibition, the economics of prohibition, right up to modern current events. And basically, what I wanted to do was to write an Austrian perspective on prohibition and the war on drugs. If you're familiar with Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, and the subsequent volume on policy called Power and Market, the Mises Institute has put the whole thing together in one volume of over 1,000 pages. But Power and Market was one of the first books in Austrian economics that I ever read or got my hands on. And this was in the dark ages when there was no internet and no PDFs or anything like that. And I just happened to get a copy of Power and Market, and I realized that Murray Rothbard put a great deal of emphasis on the concept of prohibition. And what really is behind all that is that there's so many prohibitions in our daily lives. It's just that alcohol prohibition in our history and the war on drugs are the most prominent examples of that. So basically, our government prevents us from doing many, many things. And so I wanted to make a statement and provide an analysis using the war on drugs and using the alcohol prohibition of the 1920s and early 30s as a big example of what that does, so that we get a better grasp on what government is doing to us and what it's preventing us from doing and becoming. And so that was the genesis of it. And basically, I started out with a history of what economists have done and what they've thought about prohibition. And much to my surprise, early American economists were big promoters of the idea of prohibition. And the more I read about that, the more I realized that those early American economists, they were called the progressives, they were actually fascists. And basically, the more I read, the more I was disappointed in how awful their analysis was back in those days. And of course, they really haven't. Mainstream economics really hasn't improved much from those early days. And I guess the biggest contribution in the book is on the topic of potency, the potency of drugs. And basically, what I found is that when you put prohibition on a good, and when you have law enforcement involved, you have the courts involved, you have prison sentences involved, it creates a lot of risk in that market, and that risk means that the people involved on the supply side, the smugglers, the drug dealers, and so forth, they're going to try to avoid that risk or lower that risk by bringing in the product and selling a product that's very compact, and where all the other attributes of the product are eliminated in favor of concentrating that product in its most highly potent form. And so that's the basic theory behind the potency of illegal drugs. And what I found is that when the war on drugs started, marijuana potency started increasing at a very fast rate. And so in the 1960s, marijuana potency was usually between 1% and 0.5%. And by the 1980s, it was averaging about 4%. And today, most marijuana that you purchase averages about 10% potency. And of course, some of the highly refined stuff can be as high as 25%. And I've heard about a new product that's hit the market called wax paper or something like that, where it's just pure THC, and the smallest speck of that stuff will almost knock you off your feet. It's so strong and so potent. And along with that increase in THC potency, growers have found that they also decreased the amount of CBD. And CBD is a similar chemical to THC, but it doesn't get you high, and it actually reduces the high from THC. So back in the 60s and 70s, when the potency THC was lower and CBD was higher, people got what they referred to as high. In contrast to that, starting in the 80s and 90s and on up to the current time, now people get stoned. So there's a difference in the experience that's signified by those two terms, getting high or getting stoned. They're two different effects. And that's resulted from prohibition and from the war on drugs. People no longer get high so much unless they have special access to special, types of marijuana, which is, when we look at the legalization in Colorado and Washington, growers, dealers, and consumers are looking into precisely those types of things, depending upon whether they're using it medicinally or recreationally. They're looking for products that will meet their needs, and dealers and growers are looking to create products that meet those needs. And so that's another feature, is that in prohibition, there's not a lot of consumer sovereignty. The consumer is not sovereign in those markets. They're not well served. And of course, it's dangerous for consumers. Whereas if you look at open legal markets, you see suppliers and dealers not catering to the forces of law enforcement and prohibition. They're catering directly to consumers. And so another thing we're seeing, well, as I was saying, in Colorado, what we're seeing is that these growers and manufacturers and suppliers products that are safer, more dependable, and of uniform dosages. And when we get to the harder drugs like morphine and heroin and Oxycontin and Vicodin, we're seeing thousands of people die each year from overdoses. And those overdoses occur because you don't have uniform dosages. So when a heroin addict, is in And so these legal marijuana growers and manufacturers are coming up with ways where you can get uniform dosages. And so they're making edibles, for example, and they're trying to, they refine the THC and other components, and then they put it into, candies and cookies. They're trying to find ways so you can get uniform dosages. And they also have these, electronic cigarettes now that instead of nicotine, they dispense marijuana or cannabis or basically THC in a uniform dose. So that's the difference between a free market and government prohibition. And a lot of that comes down to safety. And, before we had government intervention in all of these drugs, marijuana, opium, cocaine, there was no social problems. There was not a lot of deaths or overdoses or anything like that. I mean, you basically had people smoking very low dosage marijuana or low dosage smoking opium on the fringes of society. And then, of course, you had Coca-Cola dispensing a lot of Coca-Cola that had cocaine in it. And people weren't necessarily really getting all that high from any of those products. No one was dying. Everything was pretty safe. And after 100 years of government prohibition and intervention, now we have a situation where thousands of people die either from dangerous illegal products or of people trying to substitute out of things like heroin into Oxycontin or Vicodin and consuming too much and as a result dying in the process. So consumers are dying. The dealers themselves are getting killed in gun battles. Law enforcement officers are being killed. Innocent bystanders are being killed. And in Mexico and in Central America, innocent people are being killed and their lives are being ruined by these drug gangs. And so, basically what I started out with in that dissertation has grown, unfortunately, more and more important as the scourge of prohibition widens its net, kills more people, corrupts society. And, I go into corruption, I go into crime, and all that in the book as well. And your listeners can take a free look at the Economics of Prohibition by going to Mises.org, MISES.org, and in the search box, just type in the Economics of Prohibition space PDF and do a search, and the link to the book will come up, and you can download a PDF of the book, or order the book online. They've reduced the price now, I think, to like $10. So you can get a nice high quality paperback for $10, and it's something that's tested time and seems to be doing pretty well. And we actually hope to come out with sort of a second edition based on more recent research in 2015.
Okay, so what are some of the things that will be in that second edition that weren't in the first?
Well, there's going to be a couple of sections. One section is going to be some of my academic journal articles, and these treat a variety of different things, including the potency of illegal drugs, issues of crime, issues of the black market. I've done some survey work on economists, which has been very popular. And I know that a lot of college students have used it as the basis of term papers because it's got all the quotes from economists about what they think about the war on drugs. And then there's a big section on more popular articles. So as issues have come up in time, I've written commentaries about that, trying to explain, why things turned out in a particular way using Austrian economics. And so there's a lot of puzzles and mysteries and problems associated with the war on drugs. I've even done, movie reviews and things of that nature to try to point out how government is screwing up one situation after another. And a lot of those things have appeared in various publications, in particular on Mises.org as daily articles. So it's going to have a lot of great stuff in there. It's going to be a lot of interesting stuff, popular stuff in the beginning of the book, and then more academic sort of things where you can really dig into important issues about the war on drugs. A lot of references, so if you're into the war on drugs, if you're interested in doing research on that or writing papers about that, this is going to be a great resource for people, hopefully for many years to come.
Great. So in your book, you do talk about black markets and how they behave differently than normal markets. Could you go into that a little bit for our listeners?
Well, I think that that's really a very important thing. The differences between black markets and free markets, and maybe even more importantly, that black markets are the result of government intervention. Now, with prohibition, that's a little more obvious, but black markets, the underground economy, that's all driven, including corruption and bureaucracy. All of these virulent problems that permeate society are all generated by government intervention. And that can be taxation, that can be regulation, or that can be prohibition, which creates these black markets. Now, as bad as black markets are, they're better than having no access to a particular product whatsoever. Like I was saying, black markets have lots of problems with them. They're the result of government intervention, but it beats not having access to a good or service entirely. And so black markets are what they are, and in general, what we see from black markets is a poor quality product, issues of safety, there's issues of quality, so there's all sorts of problems that can prop up in black markets. And of course, once you get into black markets, you lose all of the normal sources of safety in the market economy. So you don't have access to the rule of law. You don't have product quality. You don't have market regulation and competition. You don't have mass production because, of course, there's black markets. So operators have to be very small and elusive. They don't have to back up their product very often because they come into markets and leave markets very quickly. And so, you can imagine all sorts of problems propping up, including, of course, typically speaking, very high prices compared to what the market would produce. And, so you just pick whatever black market is that you can see, and you find all sorts of problems that are involved. Illegal loaning, loan sharking. It's a lot different than borrowing money from your bank. The interest rates are super high. And if you fail to pay, instead of, going to court, somebody breaks your hand or something like that. So all the negative ramifications of black markets harm consumers. And of course, prices tend to be very high. And as a result, the consumer satisfaction in those markets is much, much lower. And this basically means it reduces our standard of living to the extent that black markets have to be resorted to by market participants.
Okay. So what are some of the arguments that mainstream economists in particular have offered in favor of prohibition, and especially in favor of drug prohibition?
Well, the prohibitionists, they say that drugs are harmful, illegal drugs are unnecessary, drugs are dangerous, and that if we don't prohibit them, that there'll be a huge population of hardcore drug addicts. So, for example, at the Oxford Union debate, the other side said that drugs are bad, drugs are dangerous. Of course, we said that too. We don't deny the fact that drugs are dangerous. And as a matter of fact, the arguments that we're making is that drug prohibition has actually made those drugs much more dangerous. And that one of the things in favor of legalization is that markets make drugs safer, not completely safe, but safer than they otherwise would be. And so the drugs are bad. We agree. The other one was that some of their arguments are so just outright silly. Their primary debater said that if we legalize drugs, that in a very short period of time, most of the population would be addicted to hardcore drugs. So basically what he's saying is that if we legalized heroin, that everybody would become a hopeless heroin addict. And that's just really not the case. And so they were making arguments that were basically things that we didn't disagree with, the fact that drugs are dangerous. And then they made these outrageous claims that that everybody would start using these things if they had access to them. Even though we pointed out that, of course, basically, if you're interested in trying one of these illegal drugs, you can get access to them. They're available in federal prisons. They sell illegal drugs on the street of Washington, D.C. And at one point, there was an actual market for illegal drugs in front of the Drug Enforcement Agency. So, these things are available no matter how much they try to, track these things down and to come down on the dealers in the war on drugs. They're still there. And of course, the prices are higher than the marketplace, but they're not too high as to really discourage people from consuming them. So the vast majority of the population is not interested in consuming illegal drugs, particularly hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, morphine. Everybody pretty much knows that morphine, heroin are addictive. Cocaine is considered very addictive. Actually, tobacco and nicotine is the most addictive product, according to the experts in the field of addiction. But everybody knows that those products are, you're at risk of being addicted to them. And Oxycontin and Vicodin are also addictive. But even though they are addictive, it doesn't mean that people cannot break those addictions. People do that all the time. As a matter of fact, it's kind of a pattern where heroin addicts, you develop an addiction as young adults, and they eventually grow out of those addictions. They grow tired of the health consequences of heroin addiction, and as they get older and more mature, they usually, if they're not killed by an overdose, a lot of them either highly regulate their consumption or they just stop consuming it altogether. So the real world reality is, unfortunately, the people don't see it. Economists who support prohibition, and that's a minority, by the way, look at it in terms of productivity. That drug abuse, where you're using something too much, including alcohol, means that people aren't as productive. They're at risk of creating industrial accidents, car wrecks, truck wrecks, machinery wrecks, things of that nature. But generally speaking, the workforce has ways of regulating those bad behaviors, such as drug testing and requiring people not to consume drugs while on the job. Airplane pilots, truck drivers, all of those people are regulated and tested by their own companies because the insurance companies require that. So again, once you get into a legal market setting, the normal forces of the marketplace, like companies that doing dangerous work have to have insurance company requiring monitoring of drug use on the job or by employees in general. And so that's not something that generally takes place in black markets, of course, although employers do test their employees for illegal drugs in some instances as well. However, I said that most economists don't support the war on drugs, but their methodology blinds them to the true nature of prohibition. And I pointed this out in many of my publications in that forthcoming book. They view prohibition pretty much as the prohibitionists do. They look at prohibition and law enforcement as reducing the supply and raising the price, and therefore providing some benefit to society, some reduction in consumption. What I point out is that price is, of course, very important. Quantity is very important in economics. But in the war on drugs and prohibition, the most important thing to look at is the fact that prohibition changes everything, not just price and quantity. So the product is different. It's much more dangerous, much more potent, much more addictive. Market conditions are much more dangerous, result in a lot of violence and a lot of deaths. And that potent product results in a lot of overdoses. And so that basic supply and demand, price and quantity analysis is just way insufficient to understand the true nature of prohibition. And so they get caught up in that kind of analysis, and they start looking for, well, what's the optimum penalty that we can put on these markets? And the problem with that optimal penalty or fine, tax, is that it still leaves in place all of these other problems, all of these other unintended consequences that with legalization you can solve. And so the potency problem, the overdose problem, the addiction problem, the violence, the corruption, the crime, all of those problems are dealt with by legalization. If we legalize drugs, it's not just going to have a marginal effect on a country like Nicaragua and Mexico. If we legalize drugs in the United States, we wipe out all of that nonsense of violence and stuff that's going on in Central America and Mexico. You guys probably saw a report recently that marijuana growers in North Mexico have decided not to plant crops this year because they can't make enough money, because the wholesale price in Mexico has fallen so much because of legalization in the state of Colorado. So that increase in supply of dependable market-produced marijuana in Colorado has reduced the price to the extent that these illegal dealers, these illegal growers, have been run out of business. So, a little bit of legalization is going to clear up a lot of problems in this world. Back in 1933, when the U.S. Repealed alcohol prohibition, it was at the depths of the Great Depression, and yet it sent a shockwave of hope throughout American society. The organized crime was almost eliminated. Street crime, street gangs were almost entirely wiped out. Speakeasies were closed. Bars and restaurants were opened. The breweries started brewing. The distilleries started distilling. The vineyards were put back to work making wine. Those facilities, people moving those products around the American economy, and the price to consumers for a beer fell dramatically, or for a drink fell dramatically, despite the fact that government had come back in and, of course, taxed all of these products. And so tax revenues also went up. So it was a big shot in the arm for American society across the board. Within a year, the murder rate in the United States was cut in half. By 50%, the murder rate was reduced. Violent crime, street crime, all of that fell dramatically. New jobs were created, and new businesses were started. You could get a drink when you wanted it for a quarter of the price, and yet tax revenues went up. And schools could afford to pay teachers. They could afford to pay, all of the city servants and services. And so it's just a remarkable thing. Very often the war on drugs and its evil effects don't come into our daily lives. We don't realize all of the negative effects it has on American society, but it's all there. And if you pay attention enough, you'll realize, like the situation with children crossing the Mexican border from Central American countries, everybody's on TV complaining about it and saying how awful it is. Officials are completely perplexed. And yet, if you look at the mainstream media, and again, this is why I think alternative media such as this show is so important, they don't mention the war on drugs. And I have an article coming out next week on Mises.org where I explain that all of the reason these people are leaving their homes from Central America is because they want to get away from the evil effects of the war on drugs that we've caused in those countries. Those are the transportation lines of drugs coming up from Central America, and the drug kingpins live there. The organized crime syndicates are based there, and they've completely disrupted society. They've turned it into a gang-run society where there's a lot of violence and a lot of intimidation. And so they've lost the rule of law completely in those countries. And they've destroyed jobs. Nobody wants to set up a new facility in one of those countries because of the amount of violence and the fact that their police and their courts and their politicians and their military have been infiltrated completely by these drug gangs. And so that's why people are leaving, because they can't live a free life, free from violence and intimidation. And they can't get a job because of what the war on drugs has done in those countries. But you won't see the mainstream media talk about that at all. And I think it's completely perplexing to me, because we know that this is happening. The Economist magazine in 2011 ran a complete story on this and how the drug war had basically infiltrated these Central American societies, and that they were going to collapse pretty soon, and they were dead right. Fortunately, the people Economist magazine have, at least a few of them have read some Austrian economics, and so they're aware of what's going on. The mainstream media is completely pitiful on this whole subject.
Well, we'd love to talk to you some more. We have so many more questions we'd love to ask, but we've taken up a lot of your time already. And one final question definitely we want to ask is, how can our listeners follow you, and where can they read more of your work if they're interested in following you more?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, Thornton. I'm on Facebook. You can go to the Mises Institute Facebook page, and of course, mises.org. It's the largest economics web page in the world, and it's meant for real people with real interest in how the economy works and why government screws it up all the time. And I encourage everybody to check us out, to subscribe to our daily article. It's all free stuff. And also we have the Mises University coming up very quickly, and that's, of course, been completely sold out for a long time. But you can watch the Mises University on the virtual Mises University on Mises.org. So go find that today and get registered. There's a very small registration fee, and you just get some of the greatest Austrian economists in the world, as well as Judge Anthony Napolitano will be with us this year. So it's going to be a great time, and I encourage everybody to at least stop in and take a peek. You can get in free, but it's if you go by the Academy, you get a much better experience by registering there.
Well,
thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for being so generous with your time, and for agreeing to come on the show with us today.
Adam, Daniel, it's been a great pleasure. Best wishes in the show. As I said, alternative media is very, very important going forward, and I look forward to doing many shows with you in the future.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
We will definitely have you back on in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.